The Renaissance Ballroom on 138th Street and 7th Avenue was hosting the annual Harlem Community Gala, a formal fundraiser attended by doctors, lawyers, ministers, business owners, and the political elite of Black New York. Women wore evening gowns purchased for boutiques on 125th Street. Men wore tuxedos tailored on Lenox Avenue. Count Basie's orchestra played on the main stage while 200 guests danced, networked, and celebrated another year of Harlem's economic and cultural achievements. At table 7, near the band but far enough from the dance floor for quiet conversation, sat Mayme Johnson, 43 years old, elegant in a midnight blue gown, her hair styled in the sophisticated waves fashionable among Harlem's social elite. She was laughing at something Reverend Adam Clayton Powell Jr. had just said, her hand resting on the table beside a glass of champagne she'd barely touched. Mayme Johnson was Bumpy Johnson's wife, and in Harlem, that meant something profound. She was untouchable, protected not just by her husband's fearsome reputation, but by an unwritten code that governed criminal life. You could challenge a man's business, threaten his operations, even attempt violence against him directly. But you never, under any circumstances, touched his family. The man who walked through the Renaissance Ballroom service entrance at 7:43 p.m. either didn't know that rule but didn't care. His name was Luther Graves, 38 years old, born in Valdosta, Georgia. According to FBI files declassified in 2001, Graves had suspected involvement in 11 lynchings across Georgia and South Carolina between 1938 and 1950. He'd been arrested twice. Both times witnesses mysteriously recanted their testimony before trial. He was a Klan enforcer, a killer, and a man who'd spent his entire adult life believing that violence against Black people carried no consequences. He was in New York for one reason: to send a message that white supremacist terrorism could reach anywhere, could touch anyone, even in Harlem. Graves had been drinking since noon. He wore a poorly fitting tuxedo stolen from a rental shop in Queens, allowing him to blend with the gala's formal dress code. He carried a .38 revolver in his jacket pocket, and a hatred so deep it had consumed whatever humanity he might have once possessed. At 7:44 p.m., Graves walked directly to table 7. According to testimony from Dr. Marcus Webb, a physician sitting at the adjacent table, Graves moved with the deliberate purpose of someone who'd rehearsed this moment. He didn't scan the room, didn't hesitate, walked straight to Mayme Johnson and grabbed her arm. "You're coming with me," Graves said, his Georgia accent thick and slurred. Mayme looked at him with more confusion than fear. "Excuse me. I said you're coming with me. You're in. Husband thinks he's somebody. Thinks he can live like white folks. Time to remind him what happens when his kind forgets their place." The music stopped, not because the band had been instructed to stop, but because Count Basie, who'd known Bumpy Johnson for 15 years, who'd watched the Johnson family at dozens of events, saw what was happening and instinctively signaled his musicians to halt. In 3 seconds, the entire ballroom went silent. 200 people turned to look at table 7, where a white man with a Georgia accent was gripping Mayme Johnson's arm hard enough to bruise, pulling her from her chair. Reverend Powell stood immediately. "Sir, release her. Now." Graves pulled his revolver, pointing at Powell. "Sit down, preacher. This ain't your business." Powell didn't sit, but he didn't advance either, because a man with a gun, drunk, operating on ideology rather than logic, that was unpredictable danger. Mayme, despite the gun pointed at her protector and the hand bruising her arm, maintained the composure that had made her Harlem's most respected woman. "You're making a terrible mistake." Graves laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "The only mistake is thinking your criminal husband makes you special. You're just another woman who needs to learn respect." He yanked Mayme toward the ballroom's rear exit, guns swinging wildly between Powell and the crowd, clearly expecting compliance, expecting fear, expecting that nobody would dare intervene. He was wrong on all counts, because at that exact moment, Bumpy Johnson walked through the ballroom's main entrance. Johnson had been delayed at a business meeting downtown. He'd arrived 23 minutes late to the gala, late enough to miss cocktails, but in time for dinner. He wore a perfectly tailored tuxedo, diamond cufflinks his wife had given him for their anniversary, and the calm expression of a man who expected a pleasant evening. Then he saw his wife being dragged across the ballroom by a white man with a gun. The room held its breath, because everyone there understood what they were witnessing. The one transgression that would strip away every rule Bumpy Johnson normally operated under. The one violation that would transform Harlem's most strategic criminal mind into something far more primal and dangerous. Bumpy didn't shout, didn't run, didn't draw a weapon. He simply said 5 words that carried across the silent ballroom like a death sentence. Put my wife down, now. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The absolute certainty in those 5 words, the promise of consequences beyond imagination, made every person in that room understand that they were about to witness something that would be discussed in Harlem for decades. Luther Graves turned to face Bumpy Johnson, gun still pressed against Mayme's back, and smiled. You must be the gangster. You don't look so tough. Last chance, Bumpy said quietly. Release her and walk out alive. Or keep holding her and discover why people who threaten my family don't live long enough to regret it. Graves' smile widened. You threatening me, boy? I've killed more of your kind than you can count. One more don't make no difference. And that's when Bumpy Johnson did something that made 200 people freeze in place. He smiled back. Not the polite smile of social interaction. Not the cold smile of calculated violence. Something worse. The smile of a man who'd just been given permission to do something he'd spent years restraining himself from doing. Good, Bumpy said softly, because I was hoping you'd choose the hard way. To understand what happened next in the Renaissance Ballroom, you need to understand what Bumpy Johnson had built by May 1952, and more importantly, what attacking his wife meant in the context of that power. By 1952, Johnson was 47 years old and had survived everything the criminal underworld, law enforcement, and racist America could throw at him. He'd outlasted Dutch Schultz's attempted takeover of Harlem in the 1930s. He'd served federal prison time from 1951 to 1952 on conspiracy charges, but maintained his organization through loyal lieutenants. He controlled numbers operations, generating an estimated $50 million annually across Harlem and significant portions of the Bronx. But Johnson's real power in 1952 came from something more sophisticated than criminal enterprise. He'd become Harlem's unofficial government. He funded scholarship programs that sent 43 Harlem students to college in 1951 alone. He operated a bail fund that helped families retrieve loved ones from Rikers Island. He mediated disputes that would otherwise have turned violent, maintaining peace through respected authority rather than fear. And he protected the neighborhood from both external threats, like organized crime families trying to expand into Harlem, and internal chaos that could have destroyed the community. Mayme Johnson was central to that legitimacy. While Bumpy operated in shadows, Mayme existed in daylight. She sat on charity boards, organized community events, represented the Johnson family at church functions. She transformed Bumpy's criminal wealth into community investment, making donations that looked legitimate because she delivered them personally with grace and dignity. She was the acceptable face of an unacceptable empire, and Luther Graves had just grabbed her in front of 200 witnesses. The annual Harlem Community Gala was specifically significant because it represented the neighborhood's aspirational class. Not criminals, not street hustlers, but doctors, lawyers, educators, the professional elite who'd achieved success despite systematic racism. These were people who normally maintained distance from Bumpy Johnson's world, who acknowledged his community contributions while privately disapproving of his methods. But they were also people who understood that Mayme Johnson was one of them, educated, cultured, respectable, and that attacking her was attacking their collective dignity. Graves had miscalculated in ways he couldn't possibly comprehend. Inside the Renaissance Ballroom, the frozen moment stretched. Bumpy stood near the entrance, hands visible, no weapon drawn, just 30 feet from where Graves held Mayme at gunpoint. Clarence "Cat" Williams, Johnson's head of security, had entered behind Bumpy and was now positioned at the ballroom's main door. Cat had served in Korea, had tactical training that made him invaluable, and was currently calculating attack angles while appearing perfectly calm. Teddy Simmons, the political fixer, sat at table 3 with City Councilman James Davis. Teddy's hand was already moving toward the phone in his jacket pocket, ready to call every resource Johnson commanded. And scattered throughout the room, 12 other members of Johnson's organization, all armed, all waiting for their boss's signal, all understanding that the next 60 seconds would determine whether this ended with one death or dozens. But Bumpy wasn't looking at his people. He was looking at Graves, studying the man who'd made the last mistake of his life. "You're drunk," Bumpy observed calmly, "which means you're not thinking clearly. So let me explain your situation in simple terms. You're in a room with 200 witnesses. You're holding the wife of Harlem's most connected man, and you have approximately 30 seconds to make a choice that determines whether you leave here in handcuffs or a body bag." Graves tightened his grip on Mayme's arm. "I leave here however I want, with her as insurance. You try stopping me, I shoot her first, then as many of these uppity as I can before your boys take me down. That's my insurance." "No," Bumpy corrected. "That's your delusion, because you're assuming I care more about your life than my wife's dignity. You're assuming I'll negotiate. You're assuming there's a scenario where you walk out of here alive after touching her. Then she dies too," Graves said. "That a price you willing to pay?" The question hung in the air, and everyone in the ballroom was wondering the same thing. Would Bumpy risk Mayme's life to maintain his reputation? Would he negotiate to save her? Would he? Mayme answered before Bumpy could. "Luther Graves," she said quietly, her voice carrying the same absolute calm her husband projected. "That is your name, isn't it? Luther Graves from Valdosta, Georgia, suspected in 11 lynchings. Wanted in South Carolina for the murder of Reverend Thomas Mitchell in 1949, though charges were dropped when witnesses recanted." Graves looked shocked that she knew his name. "You think we didn't know you were coming?" Mayme continued. "You think we didn't know that a Georgia Klan enforcer was in New York planning violence? You think my husband builds the kind of organization he has without intelligence networks that track threats before they arrive?" This was news to Graves, and to most people in the room. "We've known about you for 11 days, Mayme said. "Since you checked into that boarding house on 42nd Street using a fake name. Since you met with 3 other white supremacists at a diner in Queens. Since you purchased that stolen tuxedo so you could infiltrate this event. We've known everything, Mr. Graves. And we've been waiting." "Waiting for what?" Graves demanded, his confidence starting to crack. Bumpy smiled again. "For you to commit a crime so public, so documented, with so many witnesses, that when you disappear, nobody, not the FBI, not local police, not even your Klan friends, will waste time looking for you." At that moment, the ballroom's main doors opened. FBI Special Agent Robert Morrison entered with 6 other federal agents. "Luther Graves," Morrison announced, "you're under arrest for interstate flight to avoid prosecution for the 1949 murder of Reverend Thomas Mitchell in South Carolina. Federal warrant. You have the right to remain silent." Graves spun toward the FBI agents, confusion replacing his earlier confidence. "What? How did you?" "We've been tracking you for 3 weeks, Morrison said. "Anonymous tips suggested you'd be at this location tonight. Looks like that tip was accurate." The anonymous tip had come from Teddy Simmons, fed to the FBI through carefully maintained contacts, timed perfectly to arrive at exactly this moment. Graves was trapped. Federal agents behind him. Bumpy Johnson in front. 200 witnesses documenting everything. His grand gesture of white supremacist terrorism had become a federal arrest. But he still had his gun, and he still held Mayme. "I'll kill her," Graves said desperately. "I swear I'll." He never finished the sentence. Because Mayme Johnson, the cultured, elegant, seemingly delicate wife of Harlem's most dangerous man, drove her elbow backward into Graves' solar plexus with precision that suggested significant self-defense training. Graves gasped, his grip loosening. Mayme twisted free, grabbed his gun hand, and used leverage to redirect the weapon toward the ceiling while simultaneously stepping on his instep with her heel, a move that broke 2 bones in his foot. Graves collapsed. Cat Williams was on him in 3 seconds, disarming him before federal agents could even react. And Mayme stood there, smoothing her gown, checking her hair in a compact mirror, completely composed, as if she'd simply stepped away from dinner rather than just disabled a Klan enforcer in front of 200 witnesses. The ballroom erupted in applause. Not polite applause, not scattered clapping. A standing ovation that lasted 47 seconds while Mayme walked calmly back to her table, sat down, picked up her champagne glass, and took a small sip. Bumpy Johnson crossed the ballroom, leaned down, and kissed his wife's cheek. "You okay, baby?" "Fine," Mayme replied, "though I think I broke a nail." The entire room laughed, tension releasing in a wave of relief and awe. And Luther Graves, handcuffed on the floor with broken bones and shattered ego, understood too late that he'd underestimated not just Bumpy Johnson, but the woman who'd stood beside him for 23 years. May 17th, 1952. 8:12 p.m. While FBI agents processed Luther Graves' arrest, Bumpy Johnson sat with Special Agent Morrison in a private room off the Renaissance Ballroom's main hall. This wasn't their first conversation. Johnson and Morrison had developed a complicated working relationship over the past 5 years, based on mutual recognition that sometimes criminals and law enforcement shared common enemies. "You knew he was coming," Morrison said. "It wasn't a question." "Of course I knew," Bumpy replied. "The question is how much you knew, and when you decided to act." Morrison smiled slightly. "We received credible intelligence 14 days ago that Graves had left Georgia. The South Carolina warrant for Reverend Mitchell's murder gave us federal jurisdiction for interstate flight. We've been tracking him since he arrived in New York. And you waited until tonight to arrest him?" "We waited until he committed a federal crime in front of witnesses that would make prosecution ironclad. Kidnapping, assault with a deadly weapon, terrorist threats, all documented by 200 people, including a congressman. Graves just guaranteed himself 25 years minimum." Bumpy nodded slowly. "So we both used him." "We both protected your wife," Morrison corrected. "The methods just happened to align." What Morrison didn't mention, and what Bumpy already knew, was that the FBI had been conducting a broader investigation into Klan expansion in northern cities. Graves was a target, but he was also bait. His arrest would provide leverage to flip other Klan members, to expose networks, to build federal conspiracy cases. And Bumpy had known all of this because his intelligence network rivaled the FBI's. The story of how Johnson learned about Graves began 11 days earlier, on May 6, 1952. Red Mitchell, Johnson's intelligence coordinator, had received a tip from a Harlem barber named Marcus Thompson. Thompson had overheard 2 white men in his shop discussing a Georgia boy coming to teach Harlem a lesson. The men hadn't realized Thompson spoke fluent German, a language they'd been using, assuming no Black Americans would understand them. Thompson reported the conversation to Mitchell. Mitchell activated a network of informants throughout Manhattan, hotel clerks who noted out-of-state guests, taxi drivers who tracked passenger destinations, bartenders who listened to drunk conversations. Within 48 hours, Mitchell had identified Graves' boarding house, his meeting locations, and his general plans. But instead of immediately moving against Graves, Johnson made a strategic decision. Let Graves proceed. Let him reveal his network. Let him commit crimes publicly enough that federal prosecution would be guaranteed. And most importantly, used Graves' attack as an opportunity to demonstrate to every white supremacist organization that targeting Harlem had consequences beyond imagination. The intelligence operation involved coordination with sources Johnson had cultivated over decades. Solomon Sol Greenberg, Johnson's accountant, had contacts in the rental industry who flagged the stolen tuxedo Graves used to infiltrate the gala. Teddy Simmons had relationships with FBI agents developed through years of carefully managed information exchange. Simmons would provide intelligence on Italian mob activities in exchange for FBI tolerance of Johnson's operations. And Mayme herself had participated, attending self-defense classes for 3 years taught by Sergeant William Harris, a former Marine Corps hand-to-hand combat instructor who'd settled in Harlem after retiring. Harris had specifically prepared Mayme for exactly this scenario, being grabbed, held at gunpoint, needing to disable an attacker. The entire operation, from intelligence gathering to federal coordination to Mayme's physical response, had been orchestrated over 11 days. "Your wife is remarkable," Morrison said. "That disarm was textbook." "She's been training," Bumpy replied. "After what happened in '47 with the Rhythm Club, we decided that hoping for protection wasn't enough. She needed to be able to protect herself." Morrison nodded. "The Graves arrest is going to generate significant press. National coverage, probably. Are you prepared for that attention?" "Attention on Graves is good," Bumpy said. "Attention on how he got caught might be complicated for both of us, which is why my report will focus on FBI surveillance and investigative work. Your role will be minimized." As always, it was the unspoken agreement they'd maintained. Johnson provided intelligence. FBI got arrests and credit. Neither acknowledged the cooperation publicly. "What about the 3 men Graves met with in Queens?" Bumpy asked. Morrison's expression hardened. "We're moving on them tonight. Conspiracy charges. They planned this attack together, which makes them all federally liable. By midnight, we'll have 4 Klan enforcers in custody." "Good," Bumpy said. Then, after a pause, "Agent Morrison, I need to ask you something directly. How much longer can this arrangement continue? Me providing intelligence, you making arrests, both of us pretending we don't coordinate." Morrison was quiet for a long moment. "Honestly, I don't know. There's pressure from Washington to go after organized crime figures. You're on lists. Eventually, someone's going to demand we stop using you as an asset and start treating you as a target. But not tonight. No, not tonight. Tonight, you're the man whose intelligence helped us arrest a wanted murderer and dismantle a Klan cell. That buys you time." "How much time?" "Months. Maybe a year. Then," Morrison shrugged, "then the politics change, and we'll have to figure out what happens next." They both understood the precariousness of their arrangement. Johnson needed federal tolerance to operate. Morrison needed Johnson's intelligence to do his job effectively. But the alliance was temporary, sustained only by mutual benefit. If you're as captivated by this hidden history as we are, make sure you're subscribed, because the aftermath of this night revealed secrets that change how entire organizations operated in the shadows. Back in the ballroom, the gala was resuming. Count Basie's orchestra had started playing again. Couples returned to the dance floor. Conversations buzzed with analysis of what everyone had just witnessed. But the tone had changed. Before Graves' attack, this had been a celebration of Harlem's achievement. Doctors and lawyers congratulating themselves on professional success while maintaining polite distance from the criminal elements that also operated in the neighborhood. After Mayme's response, after Bumpy's calm handling of the crisis, after the perfectly timed FBI arrest, the professional class had to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the criminal elements they disdained were the only things standing between them and white supremacist violence. Reverend Powell approached Bumpy's table. "That was extraordinary. Just protecting my family," Bumpy replied. "No," Powell said carefully. "That was a demonstration. You showed everyone here that you have resources beyond what we imagined. FBI coordination, intelligence networks, even training your wife for self-defense. You weren't just protecting Mayme. You were sending a message to this entire room. What message? Powell leaned closer. That we need you. That for all our education and professional success, when white supremacist violence comes to Harlem, the doctor's degrees and law licenses don't protect us. Your networks do. Your relationships do. That's a truth nobody in this room wants to acknowledge. But after tonight, nobody can deny. Bumpy didn't respond immediately. Powell had articulated exactly what Johnson had been trying to prove for years, that legitimacy and criminality weren't opposites in Black Harlem. They were interdependent. The professional class needed the protection Johnson provided, even if they wouldn't admit it publicly. Reverend, Bumpy said finally, I'm not asking for acknowledgement. I'm just asking that when violence targets our community, people remember that some of us have been fighting that violence longer than the laws have been protecting us. Powell nodded. Understood. And for what it's worth, thank you. For protecting Mayme. For handling this without bloodshed. For proving that we can fight back. As Powell walked away, Mayme leaned toward her husband. You orchestrated all of this, didn't you? The FBI timing, the public setting, even letting Graves think he'd succeeded until the exact moment you could expose him. Not all of it, Bumpy admitted. But enough. Why? Why not just have Cat shoot him the moment he grabbed me? Bumpy took his wife's hand. Because killing him would have made him a martyr. Would have brought more Klan violence. Would have made this about revenge instead of justice. This way, Graves goes to federal prison. His associates get arrested. The Klan learns that northern operations fail. And you become the woman who took down a terrorist with her bare hands. That's a story that protects you and our family better than any bullet would. Mayme smiled. You think of everything. I try to, Bumpy replied. Though I'll admit, that elbow strike was all you. Where'd you learn to hit that hard? Sergeant Harris. 3 years of training twice a week. You paid for the lessons, remember? Best money I ever spent. They sat together, watching the gala continue, knowing that what had happened tonight would ripple through Harlem for years. Not just the attack, not just the arrest, but the demonstration that strategic thinking, intelligence networks, and careful preparation could defeat hate more effectively than reactive violence ever could. May 17, 1952, 11:47 p.m. While Harlem celebrated Mayme's heroism and Graves' arrest, the FBI was executing the second phase of their operation. Special Agent Morrison led teams to 3 locations across Queens and the Bronx, targeting the men Graves had met with during his 11 days in New York. Federal warrants had been prepared in advance, waiting only for Graves' arrest to provide probable cause for the broader conspiracy charges. The first arrest happened at 11:52 p.m. Dennis Carr, a former police officer from Atlanta who'd been fired for excessive force complaints and had since become a Klan recruiter in northern cities. Carr was arrested at a motel in Queens, found with documents outlining plans to target 6 additional Harlem businesses. The second arrest at 12:17 a.m. William Foster, a construction foreman from Birmingham who'd use his legitimate business as cover for coordinating Klan operations. Foster's apartment contained weapons, propaganda materials, and most damningly, a list of prominent Black New Yorkers marked for corrective action, including Mayme Johnson's name with a star beside it. The third arrest at 1:03 a.m. Raymond Sykes, nephew of Vernon Sykes, who'd been imprisoned in 1938 for assaulting Bumpy's sister Mabel. Raymond had come to New York seeking revenge for his uncle's conviction, believing that targeting Bumpy's wife would settle family scores. Each arrest provided evidence that built a federal conspiracy case. Interstate coordination, planned violence, targeting of civilians based on race. By 2 a.m. on May 18th, the FBI had documentation sufficient to pursue charges that could result in 20-year sentences for all 4 men. But the FBI wasn't the only organization conducting operations that night. Red Mitchell, working with intelligence Johnson had gathered, was orchestrating a parallel dismantling of the Klan's New York infrastructure. At 12:30 a.m., Mitchell provided the New York State Commission on Human Rights with detailed information about 17 businesses that had been providing material support to white supremacist groups, renting meeting spaces, providing equipment, offering financial services. The commission began investigations that would eventually revoke business licenses and expose collaborators. At 1:15 a.m., Mitchell delivered information to 3 labor unions whose leadership had been infiltrated by Klan sympathizers. Union investigations would lead to the removal of 14 officials over the next 6 months. At 2 a.m., Mitchell contacted journalists at the Amsterdam News, New York Times, and the Daily Worker with comprehensive documentation of the Klan's northern expansion plans. The resulting articles would devastate recruitment efforts and expose networks across the Northeast. By dawn on May 18th, the Klan's New York operation had been effectively destroyed, not through violence, but through systematic exposure, legal prosecution, and strategic information warfare. May 18th, 1952, 9 a.m. The front page of the New York Times. FBI arrests 4 in Klan plot to target Harlem leaders. Plot foiled at Society Gala. The Amsterdam News was more direct. Mayme Johnson disarms terrorist. FBI busts Klan cell. The Daily News. Harlem wife fights off KKK attacker in dramatic ballroom confrontation. National Wire Services picked up the story. By noon, newspapers in Chicago, Los Angeles, Atlanta, and Miami were running versions emphasizing different angles. Some focused on the FBI's success, others on Mayme's bravery, still others on the Klan's failed northern expansion. But the coverage created complications neither Bumpy nor the FBI had fully anticipated. By 10 a.m., civil rights organizations nationwide were demanding investigations into Klan activity in their cities. The NAACP called for federal task forces. The Urban League requested congressional hearings. Ordinary citizens who'd never been politically active were writing letters demanding protection from white supremacist violence. The Graves case had become a flashpoint, a moment that crystallized public outrage and demanded action. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, reading the coverage from Washington, recognized both opportunity and danger. The Bureau could claim credit for stopping Klan terrorism, but they'd also have to explain how they'd track Graves so effectively, an explanation that would reveal cooperation with criminal informants like Bumpy Johnson. Hoover's solution was characteristic: take credit publicly, bury the complicated truth in classified files. At 2 p.m., Hoover held a press conference announcing a new FBI initiative to combat domestic terrorism, with emphasis on white supremacist organizations. He praised Agent Morrison's work, highlighted the arrests, and promised increased federal resources. He never mentioned Bumpy Johnson's intelligence contributions. In Harlem, the reaction was more complex. Businesses that had been marked on Foster's target list, including 2 churches, a medical clinic, and 4 restaurants, understood how close they'd come to violence. They organized community meetings to discuss protection strategies, security improvements, and coordination with law enforcement. But there was also recognition that protection had come from an unlikely source: the same criminal organization that professional Harlem had spent decades trying to distance themselves from. Dr. Marcus Webb, who'd witnessed Graves' attack firsthand, gave an interview to the Amsterdam News that captured the community's conflicted feelings. We want to believe the law protects us. We want to trust that our achievements, our education, our professional status matters. But when a Klan terrorist grabs a woman at a society gala, in front of 200 witnesses, we're reminded that to him we're still just targets. And the uncomfortable truth is that Bumpy Johnson's intelligence network protected us better than our degrees did. The quote was picked up nationally, sparking debates about race, protection, and the role of organized crime in black communities. May 19, 1952. Luther Graves' arraignment in federal court attracted massive media attention. Prosecutors presented overwhelming evidence, testimony from 200 witnesses, physical evidence from the ballroom, documentation of his South Carolina murder warrant, and statements from his co-conspirators who'd already begun cooperating to reduce their sentences. Graves' attorney attempted arguing that his client had been drunk, confused, hadn't intended serious harm. The argument collapsed when prosecutors played a recording, obtained through FBI wiretaps, of Graves discussing his plans 3 days before the attack. "I'm going to grab Johnson's wife right in front of all those uppity in and show them that nobody's safe. Especially not the wise who think they're too good for their own kind." Premeditation, documented intent, racial animus. The judge denied bail, citing flight risk and danger to the community. Graves would remain in federal custody pending trial, a trial that would eventually result in a 28-year sentence for kidnapping, assault, terrorist threats, and the South Carolina murder charge. But for Bumpy Johnson, the real victory wasn't Graves' arrest. It was the 12 hours during which an entire network had been dismantled, exposing infrastructure that would take the Klan years to rebuild. 4 arrests, 17 businesses investigated, 14 union officials removed, recruitment networks exposed, and most importantly, a message sent to every white supremacist organization considering northern expansion. The message was simple: Harlem protects its own. And the protection comes not just from law enforcement, but from networks you can't see, intelligence you can't counter, and strategic thinking that turns your attacks into your own destruction. May 20th, 1952. Bumpy Johnson sat in his study at 409 Edgecombe Avenue, reviewing reports from Red Mitchell about the operation's complete scope. Mayme entered, still wearing the bandage on her wrist where Graves had gripped her hard enough to cause minor bruising. "How's the wrist?" Bumpy asked. "Fine. How's the Empire?" Mayme replied with a slight smile. "Secure. For now." Bumpy set down the reports. "You know what surprises me most about all this?" "What?" "How many people are suddenly willing to acknowledge what we do? Doctors, lawyers, ministers, people who've spent years pretending I don't exist. Now they're calling, thanking me, asking about security consultations. It's like Graves' attack stripped away the polite fiction that we were separate worlds." "We were never separate," Mayme said. "They just didn't want to admit we were connected. But when violence came, they remembered quickly enough who actually keeps this neighborhood safe." Bumpy nodded. "The question is whether that acknowledgement lasts, or whether in 6 months they go back to pretending I'm just a criminal they tolerate." "Does it matter?" Mayme asked. "You don't do this for acknowledgement." "No, but I do it for community. And community works better when people are honest about how it functions." Mayme sat beside her husband. "They're honest now, at least for a while. Use it." And over the next year, Bumpy Johnson would do exactly that, leveraging the goodwill from the Graves incident to strengthen relationships with Harlem's professional class, to increase community investment, to build networks that made the neighborhood stronger and more protected. Not because he was a hero, because he was strategic enough to recognize that crisis creates opportunity and that sometimes the best response to violence isn't more violence. It's making sure that violence becomes the catalyst for building something stronger. July 14th, 1952. The federal trial of Luther Graves began in the United States District Court for the Southern District of New York. The courtroom was packed. Journalists from national publications, civil rights observers, FBI officials, and ordinary Harlem residents who'd obtained gallery seats through connections or sheer determination. Graves sat at the defense table, looking smaller than he had in the Renaissance Ballroom. Prison had stripped away his earlier confidence. Federal detention had given him time to understand exactly how thoroughly he'd miscalculated. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. Testimony from Mayme Johnson, delivered with the same composure she'd shown during the attack itself. Statements from 47 witnesses who'd been present at the gala. FBI surveillance evidence documenting Graves' coordination with co-conspirators. The recording of Graves discussing his plans to teach Harlem a lesson. Physical evidence including the stolen tuxedo, the weapon, documentation found in his boarding house. But the most devastating testimony came from an unexpected source. Dennis Carr, one of the 3 men arrested with Graves, who'd agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. Carr testified for 3 hours, describing in detail the Klan's northern expansion strategy, how they'd identified targets, how they'd coordinated with sympathizers. Continue. 1:26 p.m. In law enforcement, how they planned to use high-profile attacks like the one on Mayme Johnson to terrify black communities across the Northeast. We thought Northern N were soft, Carr testified, his voice flat. We thought they'd forgotten what white power meant. We thought one good scare would put them back in their place. And what happened instead? The prosecutor asked. Carr looked directly at the jury. We got destroyed. Not just arrested, destroyed. Our entire network exposed. Our plans documented. Our people facing decades in prison. And all because we underestimated one woman and the organization protecting her. The defense attorney tried discrediting Carr as a criminal seeking leniency. But the prosecutor had corroborating evidence for every claim Carr made. FBI surveillance, intercepted communications, physical documents. On July 23rd, after 9 days of testimony, the jury deliberated for 6 hours. Verdict: guilty on all counts. Sentencing occurred 2 weeks later. Judge Harold Medina, one of the few liberal federal judges in New York, delivered a statement that would be quoted in legal textbooks for decades. Mr. Graves, you came to New York believing that your racism gave you power. You believed that violence against black citizens would go unpunished, as it had in your home state. You were wrong. In this city, in this courtroom, racism is not power, it's a crime. And you will spend the next 28 years in federal prison contemplating that truth. 28 years. Graves would be 66 years old when released, if he survived prison at all. His 3 co-conspirators received sentences ranging from 15 to 22 years. And the South Carolina murder warrant that had brought FBI jurisdiction, that would be prosecuted after his federal sentence, meaning Graves would likely die in prison. The Harlem community's reaction was celebration mixed with somber recognition of how narrowly they'd avoided tragedy. If Graves had attacked a less connected woman, if he'd succeeded in kidnapping Mayme, if the intelligence networks hadn't been in place, dozens could have died in the resulting chaos. But the trial exposed something else: the scope of Klan planning for northern operations. Documents introduced as evidence revealed target lists for Boston, Philadelphia, Detroit, and Chicago. Plans to assassinate civil rights leaders. Strategies for infiltrating police departments and labor unions. Evidence of a systematic campaign that went far beyond one drunk enforcer at a Harlem gala. Federal prosecutors used the Graves case as foundation for investigations across the Northeast. By the end of 1952, over 60 Klan members and sympathizers had been indicted on various federal charges. The organization's northern expansion had been set back years, and in classified FBI files, Bumpy Johnson's role was documented, though never publicly acknowledged, as the intelligence source that had made it all possible. August 1952. Mayme Johnson received 17 speaking invitations from women's groups, churches, and community organizations wanting to hear about her experience. She declined most, uncomfortable with the attention, preferring to remain in the background as she'd always done. But she accepted one, a talk at the Harlem YWCA about women's self-defense. Over 100 women attended: doctors' wives, teachers, nurses, shop owners, domestic workers. Women of all classes united by recognition that Mayme's experience could happen to any of them. Her message was simple: I'm not a hero. I was terrified. But 3 years ago, my husband and I decided that hoping for protection wasn't enough. I needed skills. I needed training. I needed to know that if violence came, I could fight back. She demonstrated the techniques Sergeant Harris had taught her. She discussed the importance of awareness, preparation, strategic thinking. She transformed from a society wife into a teacher of survival. And across Harlem, women began seeking self-defense training. Within 6 months, 4 different programs were operating, taught by veterans, martial artists, and security professionals. Within a year, over 200 Harlem women had completed courses. Within 5 years, women's self-defense had become normalized, expected, a source of community pride. Mayme Johnson had sparked a movement without intending to. For Bumpy, the aftermath was more complicated. The positive publicity from protecting his wife and cooperating with FBI investigations gave him temporary protection from prosecution. But it also marked him as an informant in some criminal circles, creating tensions with organizations that viewed any law enforcement cooperation as betrayal. He navigated those tensions carefully, making clear he'd only cooperated regarding white supremacist violence, maintaining his own criminal operations while avoiding conflicts that would trigger federal attention. It was a delicate balance that would last until his death in 1968. But the Graves incident fundamentally changed how both legitimate Harlem and criminal Harlem viewed each other. The professional class could no longer pretend criminal networks were entirely separate. They'd seen how those networks provided intelligence, protection, and resources that legitimate society couldn't access. And criminal organizations recognized that community protection enhanced their legitimacy, that defending civilians created goodwill more valuable than any amount of intimidation. The result was a more honest, if still complicated, relationship between Harlem's different power structures. Today, the story exists in fragments. FBI files with sections still redacted, oral histories from witnesses, court transcript from Graves' trial, and one photograph in the Schomburg Center showing Mayme Johnson at the YWCA self-defense demonstration, teaching a room full of women how to disable an attacker. There's no historical marker at the Renaissance Ballroom, which closed in 1979 and is now a community center. No monument to what happened on May 17, 1952. No official recognition of how one woman's courage and one man's strategic thinking dismantled a terrorist network. Just stories, passed down through families, documented in classified files, remembered by the generation who witnessed it and the generations who inherited its lessons. The lesson isn't that violence solves problems. It doesn't. The lesson isn't that criminal organizations are heroes. They're not. The lesson is that sometimes survival requires using every resource available. Intelligence networks, federal cooperation, self-defense training, community organization, and the willingness to do whatever it takes to protect the people you love. Luther Graves grabbed Mayme Johnson, believing her race and gender made her vulnerable. He discovered, too late, that she was protected by networks he couldn't see, training he didn't expect, and a community that wouldn't tolerate violence against one of their own. And he spent 28 years in federal prison contemplating that miscalculation. While Mayme Johnson lived until 2009, dying at age 100, surrounded by family, respected by a community she'd helped protect, and remembered as the woman who fought back when hatred tried to touch her. The freeze that gripped 200 people in the Renaissance Ballroom wasn't fear. It was recognition of power, real power, not the fake power that comes from guns and hatred, but the kind that comes from preparation, intelligence, courage, and community. Luther Graves thought he had power when he grabbed Mayme Johnson. He learned within seconds that he'd never had power at all. He just touched something more powerful than he could survive.